Hello my gorgeous makeup loving friends. So this is a new video. Hello and welcome. As you might see from the title of the video, it is an Ask Me Anything where I'm answering your questions on psychology. We're talking an awful lot about depression, PTSD, anxiety, etc. So if any of those are potential triggers for you, I would advise not watching this or maybe putting me on mute and just instead watching me put on makeup. Because I don't want to upset anybody. I have also put a list of the questions down in the description box so you have an idea of what it is that I'll be talking about. I am also doing essentially a review roundup of a whole chunk of XX Revolution products that I have been trying out for the last month or so, and I can actually give a very comprehensive review on, and that is a big chunk of the products that I am using in this particular video. So if you want to see how I created this particular look, I mean, why wouldn't you? Stunning, then this is the video for you. Do please keep on watching. We're going to get into the psychology of everything really right now. I meant to film this a lot earlier than I actually have, but as in not earlier on in the day, although also yes, but I meant to film this a couple of weeks ago because I did put these questions out a while ago, so bear with me. I am just using my NYX concealer to prime the eyes, and then we're gonna head straight into it. I've reordered my brushes, as in like I've changed where I put them, and I think I may have slightly confused myself. That's all I need at this point in my life. There we go. No, I know where things are. So I'm just taking my big Morphe brush just to spread that out, because I'm so accurate and precise, you know, so accurate. So precise. I got some really interesting questions. I will have them typed down below in the description box if you are interested to see what they are. Hopefully future Teresa has done that. God, future Teresa, get your SH1T together. I am thinking I'm probably going to go for a fairly green look using the XX Revolution palettes, because I've been using them for a while and I just really want to let you guys know what it is that I think as part of my Revolution roundup or review roundup. I printed off the questions. Yeah, I've come with my receipts. So the first question I have, a question for a future video. Where did your interest in psychology come from and what made you specialise in behavioural psychology? I answered this before in another video, but I mean, why not? Let's just start off with that again anyways. I have found in general that people end up in psychology, this is a broad generalisation, but because they might have some psychological issues themselves or they have witnessed something along those lines with their family. So it becomes quite interesting to them to engage in some amount of introspection. For me, I have fairly significant anxiety and depression. So from a very, very young age, like I couldn't deal with like any changes or whatever in my environment. It stressed me out massively. So like, I mean, I'm talking about like the age of 3 or 4, like very stressed out. So seeing this and knowing the impact that my mind had on me physically, like I would become physically sick with the way that my anxiety presented, that made me inherently interested in psychology. So I went off to study psychology in university. What's interesting is in Ireland we don't study psychology as like a secondary school or high school subject. That's not an option for us. So I know in England they do. I think that's actually quite clever. So I was very much going in blind. I didn't know what psychology was. It just happened to work out for me. Now I initially thought I wanted to do something along clinical psychology, to go into diagnostics. That was year 1, 2, and for a bit of the final year, that was what I was kind of edging towards. But then I sat down in year 3 in a module called Applied Behaviour Analysis, and they started talking about essentially the theories and stuff behind that, and they started to show us the applications of this. So they were showing us, you know, how to use things like reinforcement with kids with learning difficulties, and I saw how big an impact that had. And as an additional side, I have a lot of family members who are on the autism spectrum, and I just thought to myself, oh my god, I didn't even know this was a thing. I didn't know that there was something that you can have that can help enhance quality of life. Why did I not know this? So I became quite interested in that, and that's kind of where my love of that kind of came from. Looking for my glasses on my head, it isn't there. And the more I kind of sat in on those lectures, the more I was like, yeah, this is clearly the thing that I'm meant to be doing. So I applied then to do a master's in applied behaviour analysis. It happened to be at the university I was already attending, so that was very, very handy. And I got into that, which was kind of insane. Like I didn't think I would get in because it was quite competitive. So I went on to study my master's, and during my master's I was doing an awful lot of applied work, and I was really interested in trying to see how you could teach language skills and like really broad comprehension skills amongst individuals with developmental disabilities. So that's what led me on then to do a PhD, because I had research questions I wanted to look at, and essentially that's what brought me to there. The next part was also Freud, genius or bonkers. Oh, Freud. Freud is probably the name that is most synonymous with psychology to most people who aren't studying psychology or aren't familiar with psychology. He's an interesting man. He did so much cocaine, like so much cocaine. I think in the end he had to have like his jaw removed or something, but that was partly due to cancer. I mean, a lot of his ideas are very salacious, very scandalous, you know, they're very sex obsessed, but actually a lot of that makes sense given where his theories were coming like historically, because you have to understand that at the time that he was practicing, they believed that female mental issues were as a result of an imbalance in the womb. Hence where the phrase hysteria came from, hysteria having to do with the uterus, and hysterical is literally like all about like a hysterical woman. So one of the ways that they would treat hysteria amongst women was, how do I say this politely? Vaginal stimulation. Get the children out of the room. So it kind of makes sense that if that was the treatment at the time, Freud started coming out with all of these kind of stages of development that were all linked in with essentially phallic symbols. Like it makes an awful lot of sense when you look at it in that particular light. Oh yes, I have this. Yeah, I think I want to use that. Bear with me now. So yeah, he's kind of coming out with some really interesting ideas at the time, which I suppose is that's how we're saying it. I think the whole thing around the ego, the id, and the super ego is actually, I mean, it's very difficult. We would call those hypothetical constructs because you can't actually falsify that theory. Popper was a scientist back in the time, and he actually gave Freud an awful lot of flack because most of Freud's theories couldn't actually be falsified. So you couldn't actually prove them to be true or not. And the cornerstone of whether something is science or not is it falsifiable? So in that sense, a lot of Freud's stuff isn't actually scientific, particularly with things like dream analysis, all that sort of thing. What I do think is interesting is the stuff around defense mechanisms. There was an awful lot of kind of like research backing that up, and actually one of my dissertation students this year was looking at humor as a complex defense mechanism, and that it's more likely to be associated with certain personality traits and kind of seen amongst, for instance, like comedians, etc. I thought that was really, really interesting. It was such a smart project. She was a great student though. I mean, all of my students are great, you know, I was very lucky. But in that sense, I think he had some great ideas, and some not so great ideas, but he's kind of remembered for the more like scandalous stuff of everybody wants to have sex with their parents. And it's like, no, they don't. Sit down, Freud. Stop being ridiculous. But you know, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, I suppose. I'm just taking this sort of little flat brush. I haven't told you what it is I'm using. I mean, we're just here to chat, really. What are great forms of therapy for someone with PTSD? Good question. Actually, there's a lot of PTSD questions, and I'm actually really quite glad that that is coming up, because I wrote a blog there recently about the psychological impact of lockdown and, you know, all of the stuff that we're currently going through. And oh, that looks really pretty. There's some research to suggest that anywhere between 25 to 30% of people may end up suffering from some form of PTSD as a result of this. So actually bringing that up at the moment is actually a really, really quite timely thing. So evidence-based treatments, because that's what I am interested in. I could send you to any sort of therapy, but whether or not it's actually going to work, that's the important thing. So at the moment, there's only a few things that constitute evidence-based therapy in terms of PTSD. The first is CBT, so that stands for cognitive and behavioural therapy. So there's an awful lot of like kind of talking it out, but also engaging in behaviours that will slowly break down the anxiety-based response. So that would be a really, really good one. Group therapies work very, very well. So that's why, you know, veterans, etc., they have a tendency to congregate in groups to deal with some of their PTSD, because it does actually work. I'm going into the big silver and the extravaganza palette. Don't know what I'm doing. So that works actually really, really nicely. Oh, I'm going full on Slytherin. Green and silver. That's right, Victoria. I know the colours. I know the colours. I accidentally said gold one day and I was like, you know this, you fool. You know this. Why are you... That's very pigmented. That's nice. The other one then is weirdly eye movement therapy. It's like systematic desensitization where they show like certain images, and it's like a weird eye blink therapy. There's some evidence around that. I remember reading that when I was like in my undergrad at the time, thinking that's very strange, but it was kind of very new at that time. But there's more and more kind of information coming out on that does seem to be semi-legit, which I find interesting. I'm going to put a little bit there, a little bit of the silver. I don't really know what I'm doing. Yeah, you go straight up into the brow. Yeah, so that's kind of what constitutes evidence-based practice for PTSD. Bear with me. I have wipes to wipe off the excess. I don't know what it is that I'm doing. Good luck editing this out. I got quite a few of the XX Revolution duochrome liners, and yeah, I mean, they're not great, but I'll use them. I've paid for them. Definitely not worth the money. I'm already basically saying that. Like I'm already giving you my, I was going to say diagnosis on this, my review on that. So I'm using, which shade does it even say? Voltage. There we go. The next question, do you think people can be born with depression or be predisposed to it from a very young age? So that comes down to the nature versus nurture argument, which I found very, very interesting. So one of the best ways that we can answer this question is through things like adoption studies and twin studies. So adoption studies is, of course, you know, people like myself who were adopted. They'll follow up with them and see what sort of traits they're showing and how much they correlate with the family they've been placed with and how much they correlate with their biological family. So how much of it is down to these are your genetics versus no, this is all learned behaviour. And there is some evidence to suggest that quite a few things like personality traits. Neuroticism would be a big one that's associated with things like depression, because it is essentially a measure of emotional instability. That does seem to be quite a genetic issue. There we go. And if we look at things like twin studies, so when we look at monozygotic versus dizygotic twins, so monozygotic twins are identical twins, dizygotic twins are fraternal twins, so they are non-identical. Identical twins are more likely to have similar rates of depression or manifest very similar psychological disorders than non-identical or fraternal twins. But then again, when we're looking at things like twin studies, we do have to remember that there's a certain amount of nurture involved. There is also some kind of theories around there on stress diathesis model, which is that a lot of us have the genetic predisposition towards developing a specific psychological disorder, but we don't. Why do we not develop that particular psychological disorder? Well, it can be that we haven't been put into the situations that would necessitate that. So there's like some models of schizophrenia that would essentially state that you could go your whole life without developing schizophrenia, but you could have the underlying genetics for it. But because you haven't had a life that has had specific stressors in it, you won't develop it. So there is that, like I said, stress diathesis model. So it's very, very difficult to determine whether it's nature or whether it's nurture, but there is definitely certain things that seem to suggest that some people are predisposed to these things and other people are not. I'm going to put some lashes on now. I'm doing this weirdly quickly. And it's not looking bad. So I'm going to do that off camera because you don't want to see me struggle with a lash. That's all I'm saying. Are my lashes put on perfectly? No, but will it do? Yeah, why not? I have an LA Girls Shockwave Neon Liner that I'm going to put on into the waterline because, why not? I figured we'd do that much together. The next part of that question then said about how their doctor said that depression can manifest differently in men, just something to do with like genetics. Hold on now and I'll find it. I was told by a psychiatrist once that there was something genetic that makes men violent and women depressed. My dad was violent. In terms of depression, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's so much a genetic thing as it may be a societal thing. This expectation of like men shouldn't express their feelings. Actually, the comedian, was it Robert Webb, had a really interesting thing about that he was saying that like men can internalize their feelings to the point that the only acceptable emotion for them to have is anger and they will lash out at society. So I wouldn't so much say that that was a genetic thing and more of potentially a socialized thing. That is a nice neon green. However, when you look at personality traits in males versus females, women are more likely to be agreeable, like a higher extent of agreeableness on the Ocean scale. So that's the 5-factor scale put forward by Costa and McRae. So the way then that works out is that they are more likely to engage in socially appropriate kind of manifestations of depression. But also, interestingly, if you look at the other variable that's measured by the Ocean scale, being neuroticism, women are also more likely to measure more highly on that than male. There is a bit of a sex difference on that. So in that case, yes. Then the further bit on that was, I also have 2 uncles and a nephew on the autism spectrum. Could this be a factor? Yes, there is actually some evidence to show that there is a genetic link between having anxiety, depression, etc. in the family and actually having a child with autism. There's also some evidence to suggest that potentially being on things like antidepressants, etc., while pregnant could act as a teratogen, which is essentially a variable that is introduced into the womb that could potentially impact development. I'm just using the XX Revolution, is it the Moisturizing primer? So yeah, there is that, but their autism is itself actually highly related to manifestations of anxiety and depression, so there does seem to be a genetic link between those particular things. That seems okay. I mean, we're doing all right there. Next question was, what's the likelihood to inherit anxiety and depression from your parents? How much of it is hereditary and how much just happens for no known reason? I mean, I've kind of essentially looked at a lot of that already, so there's no point in going into that. Do you think having the tech we do now compared to, say, 20 years ago and news at our fingertips is making people in general more anxious? It all seems to be doom and gloom and horror and atrocities, and it's hard to stay positive these days. Yes, part of it is we have a response bias. We are more likely to notice the things that could potentially cause us danger. So it's a sort of a strange little negativity bias. So we have a tendency to look at these things because we're like, well, does this potentially impact me? Yes, it does. But then the thing with tech is there are all these algorithms. I'm using the glow skin in FX 0.05. The thing is, there are these algorithms that kind of say, well, you clicked on this, so that means that you're interested in this negative news story. So the algorithm is straight away kind of going, well, this is the thing that you're interested in, so I'm going to show you more of this. In the same way that the algorithm on Facebook knows with me, it's like, hey, you really like makeup. I'm going to show you nothing but ads about makeup and skincare because, you know, that's what you're interested in. And I'm like, what? We also tend to surround ourselves with people who are similar to us and care about the same sort of thing, so it can be a little bit of an echo chamber. But at the end of the day, the thing is, negative news tends to sell and it tends to be more kind of dramatic. So that's a whole chunk of why things like social media aren't necessarily the best thing possible. Of course, there are corners of social media that can be very, very positive. I definitely think that I found very positive corners of social media. This, by the way, is an okay, well, no, it's a decent foundation. You just need to build it, like, particularly if you're using a sponge, FYI. So yeah, I do think that social media, because it is quite intrusive, it follows you everywhere. I mean, let's be real, people bring their friggin' phones into the bathroom. Like 20 years ago, when we went into our homes, the only way that we would get news would be if we sought it out, if we turned on the TV, if we opened up a newspaper. But now we'll scroll through our Facebook, we'll scroll through Twitter, and it'll give us what's trending. So what are the big major news items? Even things like, say, TikTok, there's so much of like a political agenda and stuff on that, like, which is great. It's great to see that, you know, people are using their platforms for things like Black Lives Matter, etc. But it's very difficult to find an avenue where there isn't something that is all like life is hard and the earth is on fire. So yeah, I would say actually there's a certain amount of that. But I would also say that social media can be very, very helpful in that it promotes connectivity, and there's research to show that, for instance, in the LGBT community, which are more likely to have instances of suicidality and depression than any other group, for members of the LGBT community who are more remote, so out somewhere where they wouldn't have, say, for instance, like gay bars, etc., things like social media have been an incredible lifeline to them in terms of feeling a connectedness with their community. And I would also argue as well that during this whole lockdown business, because that's what we're going to call it now. Where did I put this little... Because I've reorganised my brushes, so I've confused myself. Oh, there you are. Hello. I do look so pale, don't I? Don't worry, it'll all come together. It'll all come together. But I would argue that during lockdown, actually, having these social medias have been very, very helpful to kind of help people feel connected and not so much like they're off floating on their own. By the way, that's the XX Revolution concealer, but I'll talk about all of that at the end, because let's face it, we're busy chatting about other things. So yeah, I think it's one of those things that it's like the Lord gives it and the Lord taketh away. It can be absolutely used for good. A friend of mine, he's doing his master's in Carlo IT, and he's basically looking at the impact of gaming and social media platforms, etc., on like young people, and you know, like social work and stuff like that. So he's finding obviously that these things are really, really helpful in building like communication skills, etc. So I think these things can be good if they are channeled in that way, but they can be bad if they are channeled in that way as well. So it is essentially what you make of it. I know that's a very long-winded answer, isn't it? I'm just going to take a little bit of e.l.f., like the halo powder, and just shove it under my eyelids. Not eyelids, or is it? Who knows? It's all very confusing. I don't know what I'm doing. It's the whole thing. I myself have bipolar 2 disorder, which still has a massive stigma attached. Do you think that in the future there will be less of one? Also, what therapies would you recommend to help with bipolar and anxiety? I do think that eventually, over time, there will be less of a stigma around bipolar, because I think with the younger generation that are coming out, they have a greater understanding of the relevance of psychological disorders and mental health and the impact that it can have, and that at the end of the day, we're not controlling whether or not we're feeling depressed or anxious. It's not like, oh, why don't you just be happy? Like, thanks, Barbara, I didn't think of that. That's such a unique suggestion. I'll give it a go, like, you know. Thanks, Barbara. I don't know why I went for the name Barbara. Usually it's a Karen, isn't it? Yeah, that'll do. But I do think that because there's increased education around this, even if we're looking at things like secondary schools, etc., there is far more of an impetus there to engage with kids and with young learners around mental health. A lot of schools are running mental health workshops around, you know, these particular things. So I didn't have that when I was in secondary school. And I know that even things like primary schools are bringing these particular things in now. By the way, just using Anastasia of Beverly Hills Stick Foundation in Mink. That'll do, pig, that'll do. In this scenario, I am Pig. Miss Piggy, obviously. She is classy. I love in, you know, the new Muppets movie when she duets with Celine Dion. Like, just like, that is iconic. Peak Miss Piggy. Oh God, have I put on too much? Yeah, I probably have. Oh well, it's fine. I'll blend it out. Be grand. Be grand. We'll snatch it back from the jaws of defeat. Do I know what I'm doing? In terms of therapies around helping with anxiety, there's some really nice data coming out about ACT. So that is acceptance and commitment therapy. And while it doesn't decrease the frequency of bipolar events, so cycling through the ups and the downs, it does decrease the severity. So the upswings and the downswings aren't quite as severe. So there is some preliminary information on that coming out. So I would say that would be a really, really nice one. I know that things like dialectical behaviour therapy is used an awful lot with things like borderline personality disorder. So that could also, I know obviously borderline personality isn't the same as bipolar disorder, but there could be some things that could be useful in that. Things around CBT could also be quite useful. The exercises around, you know, understanding and recognising your depressive traits or depressive behaviours. That's quite, in my opinion, helpful. I am just going to go into this shade here at the back of the sponge, because that's what I do. Don't judge me. I do what I like, and I like what I do. Better take this on. What is confidence from a psychological perspective, and why is self-confidence seemingly easier for some than others? So when we talk about confidence from a psychological perspective, that is essentially the belief that the actions that you do will work out for you. So that is a belief in essentially self-efficacy, that you are good at what you do, etc. So why is it that some people have it more than others? Some of it is just that people are born that way. It is their genetics. Like, there's some really interesting data around the genetic differences in, say, for instance, Nigerians versus Caucasians, and people from Nigeria have more of, I can't remember the exact name around the gene, but it's like essentially the happy gene. So they're more likely to be more cheerful and self-efficacious than, say, a Caucasian person, which I find fascinating. I'm like, gosh darn you, I wouldn't mind a certain amount of that. Then not a huge amount, but now bear in mind, I am a behavioural psychologist, so I will be a little bit biased going into this pink here. A certain amount of it is down to the environment that we grow up in and making us feel as if we are self-efficacious. Do we have this self-fulfilling prophecy of, I can't do something, and this has always been proven? If that's the case, and you're being told a lot of the time, oh, you can't do this particular thing. Traditionally, there would have been that thing around girls and maths. Girls generally have very little confidence in their mathematical ability because that is what society is telling them. There's been a big push, obviously, in the last couple of years around STEM and trying to get women in STEM because there's actually no difference in cognitive ability. That's a societal thing. But a big chunk of it seems to be around essentially your experiences growing up and how they are shaping you, whether you are reinforced, your behaviours are reinforced and you're being told, no, you are worth it, you are good, you are able to do this thing. Like, I remember when I was really, really young, I used to always freak out every time I would be going into a new class. Now, when I say really young, I mean like 4, 5, I'd be going from what we call baby infants, so the first year of school, into senior infants, and I would freak out to my parents saying, I'm not going to be able for this and I'm not smart enough, and all of that, because I was, as I said before, a very anxious child. I am still a very anxious child, except I'm not a child. I'm a 30-year-old woman. Gosh darn it. And I'm looking for brushes, apparently, because that's my life. But my parents used to say to me, well, no, you'll be totally fine. And they would actually back it up then with evidence of, well, this is why you will be fine, because you thought that you wouldn't be able to go from play school into big school, and now look at how you've been able to do that and that you've done really well. And there was a lot of affirmations around, and even if you don't do well in school, we still love you. It was basically like, oh, our love isn't contingent upon your performance. So that was obviously very important to hear as a child, that love is not contingent upon these particular things. So in a roundabout way, confidence is built by the environment that you are brought up in. Are the people around you building you up, or are they actively trying to tear you down? Like, that's why you'll find that some people may start off as not being wildly confident, but they find people who are there to build them up, and they may become more confident. You may also have people who started off fairly confident and then they meet toxic people along the way who will try and tear them down and say negative things about them, and that can ruin their self-confidence. So it's actually a variable that can alter over time depending upon the environment that we're in. So hopefully that answers that particular question, and I'm struggling to put caps back onto things. I have ADHD unmedicated with aspects of hyperfocus, but with increased stressors, my anxiety increases and my ability to focus disappears. As a result of that, I tend to sink into depression. Do you have any suggestions for cognitive or behavioural therapies that might help? Yes, I do, because behavioural therapy is my jam. So in terms of helping to impact attending skills, there is a particular form of behavioural therapy called precision teaching. So it looks at slowly, incrementally increasing the amount of attention that you're paying towards something. So it might start off with, say, 10, 20, 30 second bursts and slowly building it up. So they make it so that it's achievable, because that's actually really important. Like, you shouldn't be setting yourself unrealistic goals. So there's loads of evidence around that, and it's been used around like teaching and maintaining a lot of different skills. So I would definitely be an advocate for that as a therapy, and I actually have a lot of friends who are trained in it. I may or may not have written a paper on it and how it works really, really well with individuals with developmental disabilities. But I do want to point out that precision teaching works for everyone. I have used it with typically developing populations as well. This was a very, very good question. I personally thought it was really, really good. How do I process the constant trauma and PTSD from being Black in America? I mean, it's interesting that I'm going to try and respond to this being about as white as a human being can get. I actually feel like I shouldn't be playing with makeup when I'm talking about this particular thing because I think it's so important. Okay, I think people sometimes misunderstand post-traumatic stress disorder, and they will think that you have to have one traumatic event to have PTSD. That isn't actually the case. PTSD can occur as a result of what we call small T events. So these small little trickle-down things that they may seem like minor events, and they don't even necessarily have to happen to you. They can happen to another person and you are experiencing it vicariously. And if you have enough of these events, it eventually kind of taps into PTSD. And for somebody who's Black and American, I would imagine that that is what's happening. They may not have necessarily come into contact with a particularly traumatic event, but they've experienced enough of these smaller T events, as we call them, to have this. In terms of what you can do, well, the thing is, we would often look at PTSD and kind of say, this is an inappropriate reaction to stress. Like it's not a proportional reaction to the stressors that are in the environment. But what I would argue is actually the stress reactions from the Black community in terms of the racial suppression, discrimination and huge abuse that have been perpetrated towards them is not proportional. I would actually say that it's pretty on the money. It's like, yeah, that seems fair, that you are anxious and fearful for your lives. There is data around that. So the way that we would look at like treating PTSD would be usually to kind of disconfirm the kind of narrative around that. Like, oh, if you're anxious about swimming, that let's disprove to you that swimming won't result in you drowning. But the thing is, it's very hard to disprove that being Black in America or anywhere, because it's like, obviously racism isn't just on that one continent. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to prove that particular point that, you don't have to be afraid of this particular thing happening. So in terms of psychological therapies, I think one of the things you would be talking about is having talking groups and sharing experiences and understanding each other. But I actually think the impetus is on society to change, obviously, and I would hope that anyone who is watching this video would agree with me. If not, you're probably better off not watching my videos because my content isn't going to align with your beliefs. So I don't think it's on Black people to deal with their PTSD. That isn't their problem. That's our problem as a society, that we have done this to each other, that we have made a whole section of our society feel so devalued, feel so targeted, that it has significantly changed their lives. So I don't think it's on the victims to go and fix themselves. I think it's actually more on society to try and advocate for change. So that's my very roundabout answer to that. And yes, I did stop doing my makeup because I was like, no, I can't answer that while trying to put on bronzer or whatever it is that I'm going to try and smoosh onto my face. I have the XX Revolution one here. How can cognitive behavioural therapy helps someone cope with the negative emotional responses to a past traumatic event. Yes, okay, so this actually ties in really, really nicely. Just going to put that there. Oh, let's see. I'm probably going to ruin my makeup, but it's fine. It's fine. We're just here. We're chatting. It's all good. Yes, Robert. I'm going to blend back and forward. So how cognitive behavioural therapy works is essentially, it is, like I said, disproving a particular narrative. So if, for instance, you had PTSD around, for example, almost drowning in a pool, then the cognitive behavioural therapist would talk about some of your fears around that, and they would also look into what we would call desensitization exercises. So it would be things around like getting closer to the pool, maybe going in up to your knees into the water, going up to your waist, and slowly kind of disproving, you can go into the water and it's going to be fine. The chances of you having this particular event happening will go. And this comes down to classical conditioning. It's where the whole Pavlov of it all, he had the dogs, where you have this neutral stimulus, well, what used to be fairly neutral, a pool, but it has been paired with a specific unconditioned stimulus, drowning. And the unconditioned response around that is fear, panic, difficulty in breathing, and now suddenly a pool has been paired with that. So a pool elicits a response of panic and fear and anxiety. So the way that we would detach that is to basically expose somebody to this particular stimulus, i.e. the pool, and show them that actually, you aren't going to have this physiological response anymore, because that actually weakens over time and it's no longer being paired with the same unconditioned stimulus. It will eventually fade over time, in the same way that with Pavlov's dogs, they didn't for the rest of their lives salivate to the sound of a bell. Eventually, when a bell rang and over multiple times it wasn't being presented with food, it just became a neutral stimulus to them again. They were like, meh, whatever, he's ringing his bell again, that mad man. So that's my I was going to say opinion on that. It's not really an opinion, it's like fact. Essentially. I need to fan brushes. Like, I'm still trying to figure out what it is that I've done with myself. I'm using the Risque blush. I was bullied from the age of 3 to 17. Can you get PTSD from being bullied? Yes, absolutely you can. Like I said, you don't need to have any one particular traumatic event to have PTSD. You can have a series of smaller events. Interestingly, the DSM would state that in order to be classified as having PTSD, it has to have occurred within 6 months of a traumatic event, but I think that has changed an awful lot. That was within the DSM-4, which was from 1994, but then it got revised in 2013. So the more modern revision is kind of saying, no, smaller T events can actually impact the manifestation of PTSD. Hopefully that makes sense. I had like a seed in my tooth this whole time because I'm gross. Oh well, at least I'm eating like ish things. God, I'm like flying through these, like the makeup, I mean, not so much through the questions. I still have quite a few questions to go through. I'm just going to take my highlighting brush and go into this shade, which is Echo, and just pop it on there and there and there and there, because, you know, why not? Why do things from your past, even childhood, follow you into adulthood and then affect your behaviour subconsciously? That's because these things get reinforced for us. We are very interesting in that we engage in patterns of responding that either get reinforced or punished. So we get used to having specific behavioural sequences of like even the way that we would order our house. Well, why do we put certain things in certain cupboards? That's kind of how we grew up. It's how we were reinforced for doing these things. You know, how do you load the dishwasher will depend upon the household that you grow up in. So a big chunk of it is, this is what we're reinforced by. And then, of course, you know, we can associate certain events with certain things. There's loads of evidence to show that, for example, our olfactory senses, so the ways in which we smell things, can bring back memories, because it's down to what I was kind of saying earlier about how we can pair this kind of seemingly neutral thing with a really big event, and it brings us all back. You know, like sometimes you might get a whiff of a laundry detergent and it might take you back to when you were 5 years old and playing in Pillow Fort. So that's a big thing. Certain phrases that you're told as a kid, if it's put in a particular event, can be galling. I have a particular phrase that if it's said to me, I really don't like it, and it is, oh, it's like butter wouldn't melt, because the teacher said that to me once, and I was and I still am such a person that tries to like please everyone, that it felt really hurtful to imply that that I was causing trouble, because heaven forfends. Why do I sometimes have days where I feel anxious and have no idea why? No specific event is happening, but I still can't shake the feeling. That, my love, is generalized anxiety disorder. That is where the primitive lizard brain, essentially the amygdala, just using my number 7, I'm just blendy. The amygdala is picking up on random stimuli within the environment and misinterpreting them. So that can be anything like, the weather has suddenly shifted and it's gotten a bit colder, and your amygdala goes, your body's gotten colder. It's probably because we're dying. You know, you're that bit more tired today. It's probably because we're not getting enough oxygen, so we're eventually going to die. Your amygdala will misinterpret things and be like, You're very hot and sweaty. You're clearly being chased by a bear. Let's trigger an anxiety thing. But this is why we would call this generalized anxiety disorder, because it doesn't have to necessarily be triggered by anything. But it does seem to be a misfiring within the amygdala. It is a neurological imbalance where electrical impulses are sent out from that part of the brain, the very lizard part, because it's one of the first parts of the brain that actually develops within the uterus. And it's in pretty much all animals that are still alive, because we need to have that fear response, because otherwise we don't live very long. That looks okay, I think. A bit more. Yeah, just to set it a smidge more. I mean, I've kind of done a big chunk of my makeup at this point. Any coping mechanisms for anxiety, facing things that your brain wants you to run away from. That's very much dependent upon the person. There are, of course, a whole host of unhealthy coping mechanisms: throwing yourself into work, eating, that was a big one for me, cigarettes, alcohol, etc. So what you have to do is you have to find what is the unhealthy coping mechanism that you are doing. And you have to try and find a behaviour that is involving the same sort of actions but has a different outcome. So for instance, if it's like that you're eating, that means that your hands are being full a lot of the time. So maybe you should take up something like crochet or writing or something that is keeping your hands full. I would always say, if you're feeling anxious, do speak out with friends, because honestly, that is one of the biggest things that can kind of help with these things, because friends can put things into perspective and kind of point out, well, this is why you don't actually need to worry about this particular thing that you have been stressing about. So that's one of the biggest pieces of advice that I would give there. I'm taking some of the kind of shimmery setting powder, because apparently I'm being very extra today, because, you know, why not? Pretty much have everything done at this point now anyways. Bar like setting spray and like some gloss. But I have a few more questions to answer. If you develop anxiety later on in life, is it realistic to expect to live a life without anxiety again in the future, or is it the new normal? I suppose to simplify, can it be overcome, or do you just learn to live with it? Yeah, you absolutely can learn to overcome it. Again, it's down to finding the coping mechanisms, finding out the things that are triggering you. This is what you would do in things like cognitive behavioural therapy. You would find out, well, why is it that sorry, it's just I'm looking for my glass, that's why my eyes are going all over the place. Why is it that I am feeling this particular way? Why is it that I'm getting anxious about this particular event? So yeah, you can totally overcome it. This is the lip gloss in, what shade is it? Does it even say? Oh, it does on the bottom. Heroine. Like as in the female hero. So it can actually be overcome. Yeah, I'll go with this. It's my Lime Crime Velveteen's lip liner in the shape Topaz. Do I have foundation all over my lips? Absolutely. I know. It's very appealing. Can't help it. It's hard to be this attractive. Although I did have a commenter under one of my videos say that I was an ugly bitch and that I should stop saying or making videos. I feel very sorry for them to hurl out abuse at a woman they don't know, so I hope they're okay. So yeah, you can actually totally tackle anxiety later in life. You just have to figure out what are the things that are triggering you. Having anxiety, I have realised often I develop weird habits. Bear with me. I mean, we're almost there. I just have to put on spray. So I'll answer the last of these. Having anxiety, I'm on the second page. Having anxiety, I've realised often I develop weird habits. For the past 2 weeks, I've had such a dry throat and mouth because I keep trying to swallow. Is this a tic caused by anxiety? Yes. Actually, things like tic disorder are often exacerbated by stressful events. And one of the reasons why we might engage in these particular behaviours is that it gives us this thing called automatic reinforcement. So we get a physiological sort of a feedback from engaging in these particular things, and that's why we keep on doing it. That's why some people will engage in things like skin picking, like picking around like their nails, picking like scabs or whatever. I have a tendency to do that. Twisting on their hair. These are like sort of stress responses, but they can look like tics, or like shaking their leg repeatedly. I do that. It's like almost a nervous tic. I'm not really sure what else to call it. This is just one thing I've done and can't stop voluntarily. I've never thought to ask before because it just sounds so weird. No, it's not weird. It's actually pretty darn typical. Everyone engages in these sort of things to have a coping mechanism. Being in group situations, be it online or in person, I find it so easy to get caught up in other people's views and disregard my own. I think a lot of people would agree to this too. Why is it so easy to get sucked in, and how do you stop it? I worry about losing myself. Yes, that is a very, very easy one. I mean, this is, there's a whole phenomenon. I'm just going to keep brushing at my face. There's a whole phenomenon within social psychology called groupthink, which is where if there's one strong personality in the group, a lot of people are likely to go along with their view even though they may themselves oppose it. A lot of people maintain that if you look at American history and look at the Bay of Pigs, that a lot of that was down to groupthink, that there was one strong personality that was advocating for the measures being involved there, and they didn't necessarily want to do that. I think even having that awareness that you are vulnerable to that particular thing is hugely important. Working on your assertiveness skills is also really, really important. So understanding that your opinion is valid and is equal, that is quite important. So this is something that kind of comes with time. But again, like I said, even just having that awareness, brushy, is a big step forward. I have 2 sprays here. This is the one that has the glitter in it that I'm like, I like this one. This is the Moisturizing face one. It smells like coconuts and something else, and I like that one. So I'll use this. I don't like the sprayer on this as much as I do on the other one, but you know, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. We are on to the very, very last question, which is, in a recent video on sociopaths and psychopaths, you touched on some of the characteristics of sociopathy. Is it possible to learn how to be a sociopath? Can somebody pass on these traits? Yes. And a lot of psychologists would actually state that one of the core distinctions between a sociopath and a psychopath is that a psychopath is born. They have all those traits, they're inherent, whereas a sociopath is made. So they're brought up into an environment where they're learning how to do these particular things. And actually, there's a lot of people that would say that, for instance, if you're going into working on Wall Street, etc., you are more likely to end up having traits of sociopathy because you're being taught to be this particular way, that you aren't meant to care about the people that you are working with in that particular way. So yeah, you can essentially learn how to be a sociopath. So that is it. I have answered all of your questions. If you have more questions for another Ask Me Anything as a Psychologist, you know, put them down below. If you don't feel comfortable with that, find me on Instagram. My details are down in the description box, and you can DM me. I don't want you to feel put out, or, I don't name anyone. This is completely anonymous, so you can ask me anything that you want in the realm of psychology. I'm happy to answer it. So that is that bit of the video done. Now we are going to talk about essentially the XX Revolution review. So if you want to see that bit, that is what is coming up. I'm going to zoom you in on the eyes so you can kind of see how that all came together. So these are the eyes. I mean, it was a very, very quick look. I was a little bit lazy, but it's okay. I mean, I like it. It's green. It's green. That's all I want. I just want a green look. Yeah. I mean, are the lashes put on in the best way possible? No. Is this a full coverage foundation? Absolutely not. You can see all the pink coming through. It is what it is. So let's talk about the products that I used. We'll start off first with the X Extravaganza palette. It is a humongous palette. This is primarily an XX Revolution haul video / review. I really like this. There are 66 shades and they're all pretty good. I would say with the greens you do have to build them up a little bit, but like as you can see, the vibrancy is definitely there. The blues can be a bit and the purple is actually pretty good. All of the rest of the shades I have dipped into at least once, and I actually think they perform really darn well. I would give this a 9 out of 10 because for the price you get an awful lot out of it and it performs really, really well. I have quite a few of the quads here, like quite a few of them. I don't have a problem, everything is fine. I have this green quad, which I used today. I think it's pretty good. I would give it an 8 out of 10. And that's just because I don't get why that colour is in there. Why is there not like a paler green to transition it out? Pretty good, but I would say go for the bigger palette. The X Extravagant, which I used in a previous video, it's lovely berry tones. I really like that. I would give that a 9.5 out of 10. I think that was one of the best ones that performed. I have the X Exclusive, which is the purple one. That is probably the one that performed the most poorly. This gold was particularly disappointing. It was very difficult to get it to work. I would give this maybe a 5.5 out of 10. They are definitely not created equally. I have the X Extinguish palette, which I haven't tried yet. I want to wait to compare it to Natasha Denona kind of sneak peeked a Xenon palette. I'm not even sure if it's necessarily true because I found it on like a makeup page and I haven't seen anything about it since, but if she is coming out with a £5 grey palette, I want to have this as like a direct comparison, so I haven't played with it properly yet. And the X Experiment, which is the blue, I really liked this as well. I would give this a 9 out of 10 because I thought it actually performed pretty darn well. That's a whole lot of palettes. The next thing I suppose is the eyeliners. So I got 3 of the eyeliners. I think there were 4 in all. They're okay. Like, they're nothing to write home about. I didn't put a black liner on today underneath it because I have found actually putting a black liner does help with the intensity of it, but I figure I wanted to let you guys know what it looks like without that. it doesn't really turn up. It's a bit rubbish. So for that, I would give these a 3 out of 10. I don't think that it matches the price at all. They're just not worth it. And some of them are very watery and you have to work really hard with it. Next thing is the primer. I got the moisturizing primer. It's fine. You know, I don't really notice any huge difference. It says there's collagen, antioxidants and coconut in it. It does smell very nice. And I got it as part of a 3 for 2, so why not? I didn't use this today, but I want to talk about it. It is the Duochrome liquid eyeshadow, and I got it in Stimulate. Oh my god, such absolute trash. 1 out of 10. I like looking at this sickens me. I hate that I bought this. I do not like it. Do not buy it. Avoid, 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 avoid. Avoid. I had the glow skin today, but I also have the liquid skin. I rate these as being actually very, very similar to each other. But that may be because I have fairly unproblematic skin. I'm not dry, I'm not oily, I'm not combination. It's just normal skin. I like them. It doesn't give me a huge amount of coverage. I personally like that, but if you want to, I suppose it is quite buildable, but you would be using an awful lot of product. So I would say, I like the packaging, it's very luxe. I would probably give this, the two of them, because I think they're quite equal, an 8 out of 10. I think they're pretty decent. The XX concealer, I actually quite like this. It doesn't crease, it works really nicely on my under eye. I would give this a 9 out of 10. It's very hard to find a drugstore concealer that works pretty well. What else? I have so many things that I talked about or used. I have the bronzer, which I had in the shade Demo. That kind of blends out pretty nicely, or at least I think it does. I'll probably look back at this video and be like, Teresa, it's patchy as hell. The video is picking it up in a weird way. Well, it is what it is. I would give this an 8 out of 10. I think it's pretty good. I'd prefer it if it was cheaper. This is the Overlord Palette. It's like a cream blush and highlight. I really like this. I really, really like this. I would give this a 9 out of 10. I just obviously think that maybe some more like deeper tones might have been nice because there isn't enough variety there. We have the, what is it, the setting powder in Luster. This gives you quite like a shimmer. There's a definite, it's not translucent, like it will give you a bit of colour, so be careful on that, but it does seem to work for me and I am pale. I won't use it on the under eyes though because that's just an SHIT show. I would give this maybe a 7.5 out of 10. It's okay, but nothing to write home about. I wouldn't purchase it again. The blush in the shade Risque, I really enjoyed. I think it's a nice little dupe for the NARS Orgasm and a decent amount of product. I would give this a 9.5 out of 10. I think it's actually really good. The highlighter in the shade Echo is nothing special. I've tried it a few times. Okay, like it's not blinding. Like I actually think this is doing more of the heavy lifting than this, so yeah, nothing to write home about. And yeah, I just have the lip gloss left to talk about. I actually quite like this. It's obviously not up there with Manny MUA's Lunar Beauty. I do think it's like colour wise a bit of a dupe towards Celine, but because they're so similar in price, I would actually say hold off and get the Lunar Beauty one rather than getting the XX Revolution one. And I think that's it. I think that's all of the XX Revolution stuff that I used. Like it was a lot of products. It was a lot. Like, do I have a problem? Probably. Hey guys, it's Editing Teresa here. Of course I forgot to include the setting spray because I am apparently a bright spark. So the one that I used in this particular video was the Moisturizing setting spray. I liked that one. It had a nice kind of a scent to it and it did feel like it left my face feeling like a lot more fresh, so I would happily give that a 9 out of 10. The next one then was the Brightening setting spray. This one had a strange scent to it. I personally didn't like hate it, but I know that, for instance, my friend Elena Glam, she wasn't particularly fond of it, but there's a lot of like very big glitter particles. It's not like fine like micro glitters, so I found like a lot of like weird magenta flakes on my skin every so often, and that wasn't really my kind of thing. So for that, I would actually give it like a 4 out of 10. It didn't suit me. But that is actually properly it. That's all of the products. But that is it. That is the end of the video. This was a twofer, essentially getting a review roundup and having me answer some of your psychology questions. So do please like, comment and subscribe. It helps me massively. I'm a tiny channel and I would love to get to the point where I'm monetized, and that takes 1,000 subscribers. So find your friends, find your family, blackmail them if necessary, you know, hold their children hostage and make them subscribe to my channel. I mean, don't, but do, you know. Like, I'm not advocating for bad things. Unless I am. Who knows? Look, it's like midnight here. I'm doing things at weird hours. Do please share, because sharing is caring, unless of course it's an STD, in which case, you know, like, wrap it up. Don't be gross. But that is it. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.